In August 1945, with Japan's surrender only days away, more than a decade of biological warfare research was being destroyed at Unit 731's headquarters in Pingfan on the orders of General Yamada Otozo. Documents were burned, specimens were destroyed, buildings were demolished. Shiro Ishii, the founder and commander of Unit 731, stood at the center of it, watching the evidence of his program's crimes disappear into the fire. This is the story of what happened to Ishii and the men of Unit 731 and whether any of them ever faced the consequences of what they had done. Ishii needed territory with no oversight, and Japan's 1931 occupation of Manchuria gave him exactly that. So in 1932, he began research there as an offshoot of a Tokyo laboratory whose work was aimed at developing biological weapons through the study of infectious disease. But the work soon grew too large for that arrangement, and by 1935, Ishii had built a dedicated facility for his biological warfare program. But the program, though supported by senior figures within the Japanese military, remained outside its formal command structure. And in 1936, the Kwantung Army, the Japanese force that controlled Manchuria, ended that, absorbing the program and designating it a formal military department. Then in July 1937, Japan launched a full invasion of mainland China, beyond Manchuria, and Ishii's research program now had an operational purpose. Unit 731's new status as a formal department demanded a base to match it. So in 1938, the Army designated Pingfan as a closed military zone. It had more than 1,000 acres, around 150 buildings, and its own airfield and rail line. But it needed human subjects, so Japan's military police, the Kempeitai, supplied them with prison inmates, captured insurgents, and abducted civilians. These people were dehumanized and referred to only as marutas, the Japanese word for logs, a term that came from the cover story used to disguise Pingfan as a lumber mill. By 1939, Ishii's program was operational enough to attempt its first field deployment. During the Normanhan conflict, Japan's border war with the Soviet Union in Mongolia, a Unit 731 detachment contaminated the Khalkhin-Gol River with typhoid, cholera, and paratyphus. The river's current diluted the agents, and casualties were minimal, but it was the program's first operational use of a biological weapon. Unit 731 then deployed plague as its first aerial biological weapon in October 1940 against the Chinese cities of Kuzhou and Ningbo. The Ningbo attack alone killed more than 100 people, and Chengde was then hit the following year. But by 1942, Ishii's program had also caused casualties among the Japanese army too. A campaign across Zhejiang and Jiangxi left close to 10,000 Japanese soldiers infected with cholera, resulting in nearly 2,000 deaths. Over the course of the Second World War, Unit 731 developed and deployed cholera, typhoid, dysentery, anthrax, and glanders across China and other occupied territories, released from aircraft, poured into drinking wells, and distributed through contaminated food. It is estimated that the combined death toll from Japan's biological warfare program and associated human experimentation was at least 580,000 people. And what Ishii had built drew the attention of the Americans. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Allied authorities arrested scores of senior Japanese military and political figures for war crimes prosecution. But Shiro Ishii was not among them. He went into hiding in Japan, and the scientists who had run Unit 731's biological warfare program alongside him returned to civilian life without arrest. So when American bacteriologist Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders arrived in Japan to investigate biological warfare, he did not find a detained network waiting to be questioned. Instead, he found Lieutenant Colonel Ryoichi Naito, a Unit 731 insider, who handed him a 12-page statement that outlined the program's structure. Although he denied the use of human subjects and protected his superiors in the command chain, Sanders accepted most of what Naito told him, even as his own report acknowledged the full story had not been told. But Naito was already preparing to give him more. Sanders took Naito's statement to General Douglas MacArthur, General Charles Willoughby, and Carl Compton, a physicist and president of MIT who was in Japan assessing Japanese scientific development during the war. The statement had outlined the program's structure, but withheld any damning details. So Sanders recommended that biological warfare scientists be assured of non-prosecution in exchange for full disclosure. And according to his own later account, MacArthur told him to make that promise in his name. So Sanders delivered it, and Naito's disclosure soon expanded to cover Pingfan's operations, its biological research and bombs, and the Kempei's role in supplying the unit with live prisoners for experimentation. But despite all of this, Unit 731's commander has still not been found or questioned. Ishii had remained in hiding since Japan's surrender, going so far as to stage a mock funeral to make it appear that he was dead. However, that cover collapsed in January 1946 when press reports quoting Japanese communist leaders alleged he was alive and living freely in Japan. With his concealment exposed, and also aware that the Americans had offered protection to the biological warfare scientists, Ishii took a calculated gamble and exposed himself. In February 1946, he made contact with Sanders' office, and the Americans placed him under house arrest. The Americans passed him to Lieutenant Colonel Arvo Thompson, a War Department biological warfare specialist who was sent to get more from Ishii than Sanders previously had. Thompson's interrogations were direct and hard-hitting. Ishii continually lied, rehearsed his answers, and evaded where he could. But he could not resolve one contradiction. He claimed all records had been destroyed at Pingfan, yet displayed what Thompson recorded as an amazing familiarity with detailed technical data, a level of recall that was impossible to explain if everything had truly been destroyed. Thompson had not been able to extract a full confession, but his report drew a clear conclusion. Unit 731's biological warfare research had been conducted on a large scale, officially sanctioned by the highest military authority, and the knowledge that had survived the destruction of Pingfan carried significant strategic value. So that assessment then brought Dr. Norbert Fell to Japan in April 1947. Fell was a bacteriologist from Camp Detrick, the U.S. Army's biological warfare research facility in Maryland. But he had been sent not to interrogate, but instead to extract information. He confronted senior Unit 731 scientists with written evidence of what their unit had done. Their response was not confession, it was a demand for documented immunity, a written guarantee Fell had no authority to issue, but verbally assured them he would pursue. Nearly 24 Japanese biological warfare scientists then began cooperating. But when Fell interviewed Ishii directly in May 1947, Ishii's terms went further than the others. Immunity for himself, his superiors, and his subordinates, the entire chain of command. And he told Fell the deal would give the United States 20 years of research advantage in preparation for war with the Soviet Union. So Unit 731's commander was not surrendering. He was pricing his freedom, and the Americans were about to decide whether to pay it. If you want to find out what they decided, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what that choice would cost. What Ishii was offering had not come from laboratories. It had come from human beings. Prisoners delivered by the Kempeitai to Pingfan were infected with plague, anthrax, and cholera. They were frozen alive to measure tissue damage. They were placed in pressure chambers until death. They were strapped to operating tables while still conscious and cut open, so that Unit 731's doctors could observe how disease moved through a living body. Thousands of people died producing the data that Ishii was now offering to sell. And on May 6, 1947, General Douglas MacArthur sent a radio message to the State War-Navy Coordinating Committee in Washington, urging that Ishii be given what he had asked for, arguing that the Japanese should be assured their information would remain in intelligence channels and never be used as war crimes evidence. MacArthur told Washington that the data from the human experiments specifically was useful. In June 1947, Washington agreed that everything Unit 731 had provided would stay secret and out of any war crimes process. That agreement took until March 1948 to be formally confirmed with MacArthur. And while no single document guaranteed Ishii's immunity, none was needed and the arrangement held. No surviving record identifies who within the American government authorized MacArthur's request. But at the same time as Washington's decision was being confirmed, a military tribunal in Nuremberg was reaching a very different conclusion about German doctors who had run the same kind of experiments as Ishii and Unit 731. In December 1946, the Nuremberg Doctors Trial had begun, putting 23 German doctors and medical officials in the dock on charges of crimes against humanity for conducting human experiments on concentration camp prisoners. On August 20th, 1947, as Washington was still formalizing the arrangement that would protect Ishii, the Nuremberg judges found 15 of the Nazi doctors guilty and sentenced 7 to death. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, was convicted for his role in experiments where prisoners were sealed in low-pressure chambers or submerged in ice water until they died. Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's personal physician and president of the German Red Cross, was convicted for his role in experiments at Ravensbrück concentration camp, where prisoners had their limbs cut open, bacteria and glass forced into the wounds, and bones removed while they were still alive. Joachim Mirogowski was convicted for his role in typhus experiments at Buchenwald concentration camp, where prisoners were deliberately infected with typhus. On June 2, 1948, all 7 were hanged at Landsberg prison in the American-occupied zone of Germany. But the doctors' trial produced more than just executions. It also produced the Nuremberg Code, establishing that what had been done to prisoners in the name of military research was criminal under international law. America had helped secure that verdict. And while it did, it was shielding men in Tokyo whose biological warfare network had killed approximately 580,000 people, and treating everything those men knew as a strategic intelligence asset. German doctors were hanged for what they did, yet Ishii and Unit 731 were protected for what they knew. But that law was not the only thing America buried. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East had opened in Tokyo in May 1946, Japan's version of the Nuremberg trials, established to prosecute its wartime leaders for atrocities committed during the war. It ran for more than 2 years, trying 28 Japanese military and political leaders, while American investigators in Tokyo were quietly negotiating immunity for the men who should have been in the dock. In November 1948, 5 months after the Landsberg executions, it delivered its verdicts, but Unit 731 was not among the charges, and Ishii was not named. American prosecutors had Soviet evidence naming Unit 731 figures by January 1947, but MacArthur's intelligence division had sealed the file and blocked access, and so the evidence never became a prosecution. The Soviets, however, had built their own case from the same evidence, and they were not finished with it. The Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria in August 1945, and Japan's surrender followed within weeks. Among the prisoners Soviet forces took were soldiers and scientists connected to Japan's biological warfare program. The Soviets held them through the Tokyo trial period, and in December 1949 brought 12 of them before a military tribunal in the Siberian city of Khabarovsk, prosecuting them on evidence the Americans had kept out of the Tokyo proceedings. All 12 men pleaded guilty and were sentenced to between 2 and 25 years in Soviet labor camps. American authorities dismissed the proceedings as propaganda, but the charges were specific. The defendants confirmed what they were accused of, and the evidence was documented. But Ishii was not among the 12, and that was not the end of it. At Khabarovsk, Ishii had been exposed publicly as a perpetrator of war crimes, and in February 1950, the Soviet Union formally demanded American cooperation in prosecuting him. But the United States did not respond. So in December 1950, the Soviets demanded again yet received the same silence. Ishii's arrangement with the United States had now survived a public trial and 2 formal demands from a major Allied power, and he continued to live in Tokyo as a free man. Through the 1950s, former Unit 731 members continued to visit Ishii in Tokyo. Several of his senior subordinates had already resumed medical and academic careers in post-war Japan, protected by the same arrangement that kept him free. But the arrangement had gone further than protection alone. The data extracted from Unit 731's Human Experimentation Program, reports, pathological slides, and technical findings obtained directly from the men who had run the program, was transferred into American biological warfare research channels at Camp Detrick. In August 1958, Ishii made his only known post-war public appearance, addressing former junior members of Unit 731 near Tama Cemetery, aged 66, but he was already dying. Throat cancer had taken his voice, and on October 9, 1959, he died in Tokyo, aged 67, having never been charged or ever standing trial. But the record did not close with him. The crimes had been documented, yet what had not been exposed was America's role, the deal struck with Unit 731 scientists, the evidence sealed and kept out of Tokyo, the Soviet demands for prosecution refused twice and never answered. Then, from the mid-1970s, that began to change. In 1992, a Freedom of Information Act request produced more than 100 pages of previously classified documents, and investigators at the National Archives discovered a 1947 interrogation transcript of Ishii, still marked top secret, 4.5 decades after it was written. 5 years later, Chinese victims and their relatives took the Japanese government to court in Tokyo, seeking compensation and an apology for what Unit 731 had done. On August 30th, 2002, the court acknowledged that Japan had killed the plaintiffs' relatives and large numbers of Chinese civilians using biological weapons, and then rejected every compensation claim. The evidence had been destroyed at Pingfan. The knowledge had been traded. The trials had been blocked. And when a court finally confirmed the crimes, it decided that confirmation carried no obligation to the victims. That is what the historical record shows happened to Japan's biological warfare commander. Tell us in the comments what you think should have happened to him. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And to find out what happened to the man who brought chemical warfare to the trenches of the First World War and what fate finally caught up with him, that video is on screen now.